Scapa Flow, the Orkney Islands. In 2 world wars, this vast deep-water anchorage was the northern base of the Royal Navy. It was supposed to be impregnable. But on a cold, dark night in October 1939, a single German submarine entered the harbour and fired 4 torpedoes into HMS Royal Oak. Her crew had no warning and little chance of escape.
We were all given to understand that Scapa Flow was a safe anchorage. Why else would the fleet use it?
For the first time on television, with help from the last remaining survivors, we tell the full story of the sinking of the Royal Oak, one of Britain's worst naval disasters, and Hitler's first great propaganda victory of World War II. This is Scapa Flow, 140 square miles of natural harbour in the Orkney Islands. For half a century, it was the northern base of the Royal Navy, an impregnable fortress for the most powerful fleet in the world.
Scapa Flow, the enormous natural anchorage in the middle of the Orkney Islands, became the main anchorage of the British battle fleet in the First World War because it controlled the waters between Scotland and Norway. It was the ideal position from which to blockade Germany, to stop the Germans using the North Sea to get in or to get out. So it put the main British battle fleet right on Germany's economic lifeline and strangled Germany. It was chosen because it is a huge natural anchorage. It allows the biggest battle fleet in the world to exercise there. You can do drill inside the harbour. You can store all your ships. It is the most perfect position from which to wage an economic war against Germany.
Sailors hated it. Some called it the end of the world. Nobody, but nobody, liked it. Reasons: cold, windy, nothing to do. They just hated it.
In September 1939, Scapa Flow again prepared to enter the front line. As German blitzkrieg overran Poland, Britain's first clashes with the enemy were at sea. All eyes were on the Royal Navy. But in Germany, Commodore Dönitz, commander of German submarines, the U-boats, planned a bold strike at the very heart of British naval power.
In September 1939, the German Navy's elite arm is the U-boat force. It's a relatively small group of officers and men. They've been heavily trained. They have a dynamic, aggressive leader, Karl Dönitz. They believe in themselves. They believe that they are the cutting edge of the Navy. They've got brand new boats, they've got extensive experience, and they're absolutely ready for it.
German aerial reconnaissance showed Royal Navy warships gathered at Scapa Flow. Dönitz knew that if one U-boat could get inside the anchorage, it could inflict devastating losses, and the propaganda value would be huge.
It's not mainline strategy. This is a big publicity stunt. It's going to hurt the British, it's going to damage their morale, it's going to boost the morale of the U-boat arm, and it's going to make the U-boat arm famous all the way through Germany.
Dönitz also knew how dangerous the mission would be. He entrusted it to one of his most talented U-boat commanders, Captain Lieutenant Günther Prien, a cool and professional character. He had sunk 3 British merchant ships in the very first week of the war. Scapa Flow was notorious to German U-boat commanders. Its 7 entrances were guarded by anti-submarine nets, patrol vessels, searchlights and guns. Some channels were sealed by block ships, old boats deliberately sunk in the narrow passages. In the First World War, 2 U-boats had tried to sneak into Scapa Flow. Both had been lost. Now, it was Prien's turn. On On the 8th of October 1939, Prien and U-47 set sail from Kiel in northern Germany. Meanwhile, 600 miles to the northwest, the mighty battleship HMS Royal Oak was patrolling the Fair Isle Gap between the Orkney and Shetland Islands. Nearly 200 metres long and displacing 29,000 tons, this giant was a veteran of the Battle of Jutland, the only great naval battle of the First World War.
I'd served previously in 2 destroyers, and to see this battleship, it frightened the life out of us for a bit. It's awe-inspiring, really. It was impregnable. Impregnable. Yeah, you felt safe on it. You can't imagine it sinking.
But by 1939, Royal Oak was no longer the force she'd once been.
Royal Oak's firepower is impressive. She has 8 15-inch guns. These are some of the best heavy guns in the world. They would have sunk anything the Germans could send to sea. Her problem is she can't catch anything the Germans have got because she can only do 21 knots. And her defensive systems are designed for a short-range surface battle. So she's a bit out of date, but particularly on the speed front.
You don't realise, as young boys, that she was old and slow and not really a lot of good. I think Winston Churchill described that class of ship as too old to fight and too slow to run.
Nor was the Royal Oak a happy ship.
Everybody was agreed there it was one of the worst ships around. But it does all start from the system from the top, you know, how they address from one to the other, going down the road, down the way, you know.
It wasn't a happy ship. It wasn't a ship that people would say, God, I'm glad I was in the Oak, you know. Most people said, roll on my commish, and maybe roll on the Nelson, the Rodney or Hood. And this one funnel steamship is no effing good, you know, that sort of thing.
Amongst the Royal Oak's crew of more than 1,200 were 163 boy sailors. They were part of an ancient Royal Navy tradition in which boys as young as 15 served their apprenticeships on a fighting ship.
Boys on a battleship pre-war were pretty much kept in their place. We spent most of our time cleaning, polishing, bit of training on gunnery, seamanship, but mainly it seemed to be cleaning and polishing and being chased around by instructors.
Getting up very early in the morning, scrubbing decks and cleaning brightwork and doing the normal ship's routines, getting the whole ship clean every day, and then most of our time we're taking up with schooling.
The Royal Navy has had boy sailors since the beginning of time. They took young officers and young sailors at the same age. They trained them up on the job. So by the time they're modern school leaving age, these are serious professional operators.
After her patrol, the Royal Oak returned to Scapa Flow on the 10th of October. Supposedly safe within the anchorage, normal duties resumed. She was still there 3 days later when U-47 arrived off the Orkney Islands.
Prien lay off to the east of Orkney on the seabed of the North Sea at about 90 metres. During that time, he gave all the crew a hot meal, and he prepared the submarine for battle.
When darkness fell, U-47 surfaced and sailed for Scapa Flow. Prien was about to make naval history and seal the fate of hundreds of British sailors. On the evening of the 13th of October 1939, Günther Prien stood on the conning tower of U-47. He was about to undertake one of the most daring submarine raids of World War II. His objective was Scapa Flow, just north of the Scottish mainland, the base of Britain's mighty home fleet. No U-boat had ever penetrated its dark waters.
Scapa Flow is protected by gun batteries, net barriers to stop submarines coming in, minefields. It's got patrol craft. Most of the naval personnel would have been under the impression that Scapa Flow was a safe place.
But German air reconnaissance had revealed a potential weakness in Scapa Flow's defences. There were 7 channels into Scapa Flow. All of them were defended to some extent, but 20 years of peacetime neglect had taken their toll.
In the intervening 20 years, the flow had returned largely to its natural condition. It was no longer a man-made fortress, it was a natural anchorage, and it was relatively easy to get in 1939.
The Germans had identified one particular gap in the defences. Kirk Sound was just 600 yards across, 33 feet deep at high tide, and swept by 10-knot currents. In addition, 3 block ships obstructed the channel. But small passages did remain, and there were no other defences, no lookouts, no searchlights. Prien now made for the 140-foot gap between the northern block ship and the shore.
Prien decided that he could navigate through this very narrow channel in Kirk Sound, which would take him directly into Scapa Flow.
He's going to have to go in very, very slowly. He's going to have to pick his way through some difficult navigation. He's going to have to do this on the surface. It's a huge risk. If he's spotted, he's going to be sunk. Prien wants conditions so he can think, respond, hear. He doesn't want any extraneous noise, so everybody will be very still, very calm, very tense. Everybody is absolutely on the edge, waiting for something.
Buffeted by the incoming tide, the crew struggled to control the U-boat's speed and heading.
Prien not only had to avoid the shoreline, but he also had to avoid the 2 block ships.
Suddenly, a juddering crash. They were snared by a block ship's anchor chain.
He had to reverse engines at full power, which did enable the submarine to break free. And he proceeded then on through Kirk Sound.
Then, to the horror of the men on the conning tower, a light shone on them from shore. It was a car headlight. It soon turned away, the driver doubtless racing off to raise the alarm. But it was too late to turn back. Prien sent a simple message to his men below. We are in. Meanwhile, on board Royal Oak, it was just an ordinary evening for her crew.
At 12 o'clock midnight, I closed up on a 4-inch gun, and I was detailed off from there for aircraft lookout. And I remember how cold it was and how dark it was, and how pleased I was to have a duffel coat on.
I had to go and watch at midnight in the refrigerator room. I was probably closer than anybody else in the ship because I was on one deck above the ship's bottom.
We'd had a good run ashore, me and my friend. We turned in as normal, I suppose about 10 o'clock or something, on the port side.
Remaining on the surface, U-47 crept through the waters of Scapa Flow. There was no moon. The sea was calm. Captain and lookouts scanned the horizon, but to their horror, there was not a ship to be seen. In a remarkable stroke of luck for the British, the big ships of the home fleet had been ordered to scatter just days before in case of air raids on Scapa Flow. Now, only the Royal Oak remained.
Prien's hope, and Dönitz' hope as well, is to find the entire home fleet there, battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, the whole panoply of British naval power, you know, the perfect target. You can't miss, fish in a barrel.
Prien was increasingly desperate. Every minute in Scapa Flow increased the risk of being spotted, and there would be nowhere to hide. Prien took a gamble and turned U-47 around, heading northeast. Suddenly, a huge dark shape emerged before them. They had found HMS Royal Oak.
The Royal Oak was at anchor She was stationary and an easy target for an enemy submarine. Royal Oak was a sitting duck.
From the bow, Prien fired 4 torpedoes.
Around about 1 o'clock in the morning was when the first torpedo hit. There was a ginormous explosion. The ship virtually leapt out of the water.
What the dickens was that? It wasn't a bang, but it was just enough to shudder.
My mind flashed. I thought we'd blown up.
I heard a pipe take all magazine temperatures, which sounded a bit worrying, you know. Don't they know what the temperatures are? And I saw the gunnery officer go by, and he looked very worried.
A ship like the Royal Oak has 4 major magazines which are packed full of cordite charges. There are going to be enough charges on that ship to fire each gun 150 times. Because cordite is highly explosive, checking the magazine temperatures will tell you whether you've got a problem. If the temperature starts to climb, there's something wrong and you've got to do something.
On U-47, Prien was cursing his luck. He had fired 4 torpedoes at a range of 3,500 yards. 1 had failed to launch, 2 missed, and 1 had just clipped the bow of Royal Oak.
Going into the Second World War, the German Navy thinks they have the world's best torpedoes, but they haven't tested them properly, and they're not accurate, and they don't hold their depth very well. So a lot of them are missing in this period of the war. Prien is actually relatively lucky to get so many of his torpedoes to hit the target during this attack.
Prien turned U-47 around. He fired his stern torpedo tube. Another miss. Now he headed for Kirk Sound and safety. Surely all hell was about to break loose. Searchlights, destroyers, and if they were discovered, the terror of depth charges. But instead, nothing. On board the Royal Oak, there was no inkling that they were even under attack.
People were sort of waking and sitting up and saying, oh, it's all right, it's an anchor chain has been moved or something, you know. And in fact, the anchor chain did go out with a damn big rut.
I volunteered the fact that I thought it was a torpedo. I got a clip round the ear on. Thought to speak when I was spoken to, and how the hell could it be a torpedo? We're in Scapa Flow.
There came some chaps running along the gangway, running forward, and Fred says, what's the matter? And they said, we think there's trouble in the paint shop. It's all right. So we got back in to our hammocks and turned over and went back to, well, we thought we were going back to sleep.
To their astonishment, the men of U-47 had still not been detected. The opportunity was too good to miss. They returned to try again. The bow torpedo tubes were reloaded. This time Prien came in closer, to 3,000 yards. He fired 3 torpedoes. At 1:16 a.m., they slammed into the Royal Oak in quick succession.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. And she immediately started to lift to starboard.
The bang was the thing that was the worst, the third bang. The whole ship shook. The chap next to me, he shook my arm and he said, Lofty, come on, you better get out, something's happened. And by this time, the ship had started to heel to starboard.
The 3 torpedoes had torn massive holes amidships, below the waterline on the starboard side. Those near the point of impact were killed instantly. As men scrambled out of their hammocks, the cordite magazines ignited. Flames swept through the ship with horrifying results.
It happened so fast. I rapidly jumped out of my hammock then and went to put some trousers on. Being in a damn hurry, as you can imagine, a huge orange flame flashed through the door. Within seconds earlier, I would have been right in it, stripping the flesh off me, you know.
The flash was like a living thing. You start to say, well, who's here? Where are my friends? You know, and there were chaps who were so wounded, you were almost frightened to look at them. The burning, the flash, really very unpleasant.
As the ship began to list, the electricity failed. The hundreds of men still below deck were plunged into darkness.
Then the down lights went out and we couldn't see a thing. It was pitch dark. I went to go through a door, but it was all cleated round, and one of the older chaps got them cleared, so we got through the door, and I went through this dark passage between the officers' quarters until I found a ladder going up, and I could see the stars going through the blackout curtains and think, thank God I can get to the deck, you know.
All the lights went. Then one didn't know what the hell was happening, but I knew where I was. There was a porthole, and I was much thinner in those days. I got through the porthole. And by the time I got through it, I was standing on the ship's side, show you how quickly it went.
I was just in my vest and pants, up the ladder, onto the 6-inch gun battery, go forward, up a ladder, and there was a chap at the bottom of this ladder, never known who it was. I swear blind, he was pushing people up this ladder. I mean, I don't think my feet touched the rungs.
Only a third of Royal Oak's crew had managed to reach the deck.
I was trying to get the toggles off my duffel coat. And because my fingers were pretty cold and because the things were tight, it was a hell of a job. By the time I got the toggles off, the water was pretty close to where I was standing.
As she continued to roll to starboard, men climbed over the guardrail onto the ship's side.
The keel was coming up, barnacle-laden keel. Couldn't see it in the dark. How far do you run down? How far have you got to leap out to avoid hitting it? And so taking one's life in one's hand, as it were, that's what I did. I rushed down the side and leapt as far as I could. Shook, you go down.
The movement was people jumping over or people running over, or so. I've seen people pushing somebody else over the side.
Next thing I can remember was just sliding over the ship's side. It seemed an awful long time to get through the water, and then there were bodies on people all around trying to get hold of whatever they could find that was floating on the top.
I dived in and started to swim away from the ship. And although I couldn't see her, I could feel her coming over. And I went like hell. I'd have got a gold medal in the Olympics for the speed I was doing. And when she finally turned over, she displaced a huge, great wave. It just took hold of me and tumbled me over and over and over.
The water was freezing. Many men had terrible burns, and the sea was covered in fuel oil, choking and blinding them.
All I could smell was oil fuel. I didn't realise I was covered in it.
Because the torpedo had ruptured the fuel tanks, the sea was a great thick covering of oil on it.
Horrible. You just smothered in it, you know, so thick.
Oh, there was a tremendous lot of oil about. And at one stage, while I was swimming, I decided to take my boiler suit off, thinking that was more practical than swimming with it on, which was a mistake. And then as I had undone some of the buttons, I got a bit of oil in my mouth.
I don't think I swallowed any. Didn't do anything like that. In fact, 10 to 1, it helped people to keep afloat.
The facts are that you're fighting for your own life.
In just 13 minutes, the Royal Oak had capsized. Hundreds were dead, trapped within her hull. Hundreds more now faced a fight for survival in the dark, freezing waters of Scapa Flow.
It was freezing.
Very cold.
Some couldn't stay afloat. I felt lonely. I was on my own.
All you could hear was screaming and yelling.
Nobody wanted to drown.
At 1:30 a.m. on the 14th of October 1939, the waters of Scapa Flow were a scene of indescribable horror. A German submarine, U-47, had entered this Royal Navy anchorage undetected and left carnage. HMS Royal Oak, the mighty veteran battleship, lay upside down. Her side had been torn open by 3 torpedoes. More than 300 British sailors and marines struggled for survival in the icy waters, while 800 were trapped inside her fire-ravaged hull.
Internally, the battleship must have been like hell on earth, and you would have had men struggling, not being able to see, all the heat from the cordite flames, panic, uncertainty, with one idea in mind: to get out and off the ship.
Still no alarm had been sounded. The Royal Oak had lost electrical power within minutes of being hit. There was no time to even launch distress flares. As the ship rolled over, men plunged into the freezing water.
It was so cold. I've been told it's colder then than it is in your fridge, so we might give you some idea what it was like.
Well, it was pretty total, really. I mean, I wanted to survive. I wanted to get ashore. I wanted to swim ashore. I thought that was my only way out.
In just half an hour, the Royal Oak had sunk to the seabed. Many found themselves alone in the darkness, unsure of their bearings.
I felt lonely. I was on my own. I struck out for what I thought was the shore. I picked up a bit of rubbish, piece of wood, I think, and I clung to that.
It was pitch dark, and there weren't boats all around waiting to pick you up. There were no Carly floats and all the paraphernalia that is on a battleship to save people's lives that had gone down with the ship.
On the boat decks of those battleships, they have a catamaran, which is like a wooden structure, and purely by chance I happened to bump into it. And I clambered on it, and there was a couple of other blokes on it, and that was it. I mean, I was just so fortunate in every way.
I was swimming along all on my top, very quiet. I heard a splashing alongside me. There was another lad. I established who he was. Well, we didn't say a lot because it was a bit tiring, a bit cold. And we'd been swimming for, I don't know how long. And he just suddenly said, "Oh, bollocks to this," and disappeared. I found it very frightening.
We didn't have lifebelts at that time. It was still dark and very cold by now, and I'm probably a bit frightened.
I found a chap hanging on to a spar, which he got from somewhere, and I wasn't very popular either. You know, he sort of didn't want anybody else to share his spar. He must have been exhausted because he suddenly just slipped away and I didn't see him again.
Daisy 2, a former fishing boat and now Royal Oak's tender, had been moored alongside and narrowly escaped as the Royal Oak rolled over and sank. Her crew sprang into action.
It was very dark and very, very cold, and I swam in the water there for about an hour and a half, I think, and ever hoping getting too close to the Daisy, which was miles away at the time.
I heard a voice say, "Here's another one." Now that was somebody on the Daisy 2. I never saw the Daisy 2. Daisy 2 saw me. And somebody was leaning over the side and put their hand and picked me up and lifted me on board.
I was getting colder and more tired. And just as I got to about the end of my tether, I heard a voice say, "There's another one." And somebody grabbed me, pulled me in a boat. They took me to the Daisy 2.
The Daisy 2 took us over to the Pegasus, and we were spread around her. I was in the engine room.
HMS Pegasus, a seaplane carrier, was some 2,000 yards off.
They washed us off with paraffin, chucked all our gear in the fire, gave us a blanket,
One chap got out of his mick and said to me, hop in. And I hopped in and I went to sleep straight away. Absolutely, flat out.
Of Royal Oak's crew of 1,219, 833 had been killed. Of the 163 boy sailors, 126. Well into the afternoon, British destroyers were depth-charging Phantom U-boats within Scapa Flow, but U-47 had long made her escape, battling the fierce tides of Kirk Sound to reach the safety of the open sea. Soon, Prien and his crew were back in Germany to receive a hero's welcome. It was a spectacular achievement to sneak into the lair of the Royal Navy, sink a major warship, and escape scot-free. Hitler was delighted. He sent his private plane to bring the crew of U-47 to Berlin, where they were greeted by rapturous crowds. For Prien, there were countless press appearances.
When Prien and U-47 returned to base, the whole machine of Nazi propaganda kicks into gear. Hitler turns up, medals are bestowed, cinema film is taken and broadcast. Accounts are written and published. He's the man of the moment. In 1939, Nazi Germany is desperate for heroes because they're just launched on a war which most people don't think they can win. So anybody who does anything out of the ordinary is going to be turned into a celebrity. Prien is an early example of that.
In Britain, the night's events were slowly pieced together from survivors' accounts and the German press. Thousands faced the terrible grief of lost husbands, fathers and sons. And at the Admiralty, the search for answers began. In Germany, Günther Prien of U-47 was hailed as the bull of Scapa Flow. He had scored a stunning victory against Britain in their own backyard. The British public, too, soon heard about the loss of Royal Oak and 833 of her crew.
The Royal Oak is relatively unusual in being announced as a disaster the very next day on the main national broadcast media, the BBC, because it happens within sight of shore and there would be no way of suppressing the news. The Navy had learned in the First World War that if people see what's happened, it's no good trying to suppress bad news. It's not the end of the world. It has happened, it has been seen, and it's probably best to get it out in the open and get done with it.
Meanwhile, the Admiralty needed to know why Scapa Flow's defences had failed so dramatically. A board of inquiry found a staggering 11 potential routes an enemy submarine could take into Scapa Flow, past existing anti-submarine nets or through unguarded channels only partially obstructed by block ships. Experts unanimously identified Kirk Sound as the most likely route for a U-boat.
The Board of Inquiry, which is essential after the loss of a major warship, that there has to be an inquiry. It's composed of senior officers, they have all the evidence, they produce a measured, balanced, and I think very fair assessment of what had happened and why. But it's overtaken by events. When the report is submitted, Churchill, who's the First Lord of the Admiralty, doesn't really have time to process it and write his own version, his short minute for publication. So he has to say, well, here it is. Sadly, there's a war on and I'm rather busy and it would be better that I spent my time winning the war.
The board found that local officers had known and warned of the risks to Scapa Flow, but it had not been a high enough priority in the build-up to war. Only after war was declared did the Admiralty order new defensive measures. Ironically, 2 ships sent to be used as block ships were sunk en route by U-boats. The third block ship, to be sunk in the exact passage used by U-47, arrived just hours after Royal Oak was sunk. There was only one casualty from the Board of Inquiry. Admiral Sir Wilfrid French, officer commanding Orkneys and Shetlands, had held his job for less than a week before war was declared. He'd asked for 15 patrol vessels to make Scapa Flow safe. At the time of Royal Oak's sinking, he had just 2. He had even offered to navigate a submarine through Kirk Sound himself to prove it could be done, but he became the scapegoat for the whole affair. He was placed on the retired list, effectively sacked. Scapa Flow was fortified with new nets, lookouts, guns and patrol ships. At huge cost, the eastern entrances were sealed forever with concrete causeways. They were named the Churchill Barriers, after the First Lord of the Admiralty. Amongst the mourning, there was particular grief for the loss of so many boy sailors, the largest in a single event in Royal Navy history. For the Royal Navy, there was little time for grief or soul-searching. World War II was entering its most dangerous phase, and the Navy was determined to play its part. For all concerned, the motto was, get on with the job.
Well, you're just in a bit of shock to start, in a way, really. But when you're young, you soon bounce back, and in not very long again, you're back on another ship doing it all over again. You know it. You know there's always a chance you're going to cop it there, but you're there. You've got to be in it, and you just get on with it and put up with it.
I suppose, really, thinking back, you were dreadfully upset that your mates had died, but you were thankful that it wasn't you. We were back in Scapa within a month, and I wasn't at all bothered.
By the end of November, we were back in Scapa Flow. You weren't given time to think too much about things. You joined another ship and you had another lot of worries to contend with, didn't you? Finding a hammock billet and all this sort of thing.
It did give you a sort of disconnected feeling, you know. Where do I belong? That sort of feeling. And most of all, in my case, it was the warmth and comfort of the ship that one missed. I mean, it's not an elaborate way of life, but it was comfortable. We had our chums there, you know, with our little jokes and games and things.
Günther Prien, credited with sinking 31 ships, did not survive the war. The odds were against him, as they were for all German U-boat men. 15 months after the sinking of Royal Oak, U-47 was attacking a convoy in the North Atlantic when she was depth-charged and sunk by HMS Wolverine. Prien left behind a memoir of his famous raid, entitled My Way to Scapa Flow. It was reprinted in Britain after the war. Incredibly, to the men who had been there, Prien described torpedoing 2 battleships and then evading destroyers and depth-charge attacks as he made his escape. There were so many discrepancies with the known facts that some concluded Prien could never have been in Scapa Flow. A flood of conspiracy theories soon followed. Some claimed the Royal Oak had been sabotaged by enemy agents. One persistent rumour involved a watchmaker from Kirkwall.
The watchmaker spy of Kirkwall, Albert Ortel, rowed out in a rubber dinghy across Scapa Flow to Kirk Sound, where Günther Prien of U-47 took him on board the submarine to help him navigate into Scapa Flow and point out the battleship Royal Oak to him. It was utter nonsense. The watchmaker was really a fabrication put about by an out-of-work American journalist. However, it became anything but a fairy story, inasmuch that MI5 and MI6 became very interested, and they did everything to try and winkle this so-called watchmaker out.
As for Prien's so-called memoir, it was ghost-written by a hack who embellished the truth to create a boy's own adventure story designed to inspire young Nazis to emulate the U-boat hero. Of the 833 men who perished on the Royal Oak, only 26 bodies were ever found. They were brought here to the Orkney island of Hoy.
This is the road leading to the Royal Naval Cemetery on the island of Hoy, which is about 25 miles from where the battleship actually sank. Many of the cortege were Royal Naval personnel from the Royal Oak. They were dressed in boiler suits and plimsolls because they had nothing else to wear, simply because they had lost their uniforms. The day was cold but sunny. The bodies were put into body bags, and each would have been lowered into what was a mass grave.
Author David Turner's interest in the Royal Oak was spurred by the death of his favourite uncle, Lieutenant Ralph Lennox Woodrow Clark, one of 24 ship's officers lost that night.
I was a 9-year-old boy living in Plymouth. I had just returned home from school, and I found my mother crying in the kitchen of our home. And I asked her, "Mummy, why are you crying?" And she turned to me and said that she had just heard on the BBC Home Service that the Royal Oak had been sunk, believed by enemy action, and 15 survivors had been landed. We will never forget what happened out there that night. Never.
Today, the wreck of HMS Royal Oak is an official war grave, just 100 feet beneath the surface of Scapa Flow. The sinking of the Royal Oak stands out particularly for the number of boy sailors who lost their lives, the largest in a single event in Royal Navy history.
The Parliament of the day wanted to have the law changed so that boys under the age of 17 should never be allowed to serve on a warship in wartime. Churchill tried to overrule, but thank goodness today the Navy will not accept any young boy on a warship.
Okay, in the water when you're ready.
Every year, in a unique ceremony, Royal Naval divers hoist the white ensign above the wreck of the Royal Oak in commemoration of the 833 sailors, Marines, and boys who lost their lives that cold October night.
I look at the names and I can put a face to all the names of my mates there. I can hear their voices. Little Mousy and old Cyril, I can see them all. They were good lads. They were good lads, they were.
You lost everything. You lost your friends. You'd had an experience. You didn't want it again. Remember them all and pray for them all. Hardly a day goes by without you don't think of them.
After I broke the surface and the ship was upside down, all you could hear was screaming and yelling, a real screaming, you know. And some silly bugger singing Roll Out the Barrel. And I've never liked the song since.